Hey everyone, how's it going? So in this video, we'll be looking at the basics of strict mode in JavaScript. So by default, JavaScript is meant to be easy for beginners to learn. So in that sense, it's more of a loose language. So for example, it lets us make these bad syntax errors. But with strict mode enabled, basically what it does, it changes the syntax and runtime behavior from regular JavaScripts. So now these bad syntax errors that usually would be caught in other programming languages will now be caught into proper errors with strict mode turned on. So some examples of this are that now there are no undeclared variables are allowed, and we also can't have duplicate parameter names in functions. So these are two examples of changes that strict mode makes. So let's continue and look at more changes that strict mode introduces. So first we'll be looking at how variables are changed with strict mode. So first off, to actually make JavaScript use strict mode, we have to use strict. So this will tell JavaScript to use strict mode pretty much. So now, as in the example before, we see that variables now must be declared, right? So if we declare a variable without using var, let, or const, an error will be thrown. So we just start quokka. Let's imagine we have an x equals 100. So as you can see, x is not defined, but in normal JavaScript, if we had done this, then this x would be created as a variable in the global scope. Speaking of global scope, it should be noted that when I do use strict like this is in the global scope, but strict mode can also be function scoped. So if you can imagine, we did function, my function, and we'll just comment this out as well. So we did use strict here. And we did, let's say, x or y equals 100. I would run the function first. So again, we see y is not defined, and that's because we use strict right here. But if we uncomment this out, this x we did before, this will be fine because this strict here is only scoped in this function, and there's no new strict in global scope. So if console log this out, we'll be getting 100 as expected because this was created in the global scope. So moving on with this, we're going to go to using a bit different with objects. So strict mode also makes some changes to how objects are used. So two differences are that we can't assign values to non-writable properties. For example, this one, let's say we had an object of a non-writable object. And we'll just say it has x equals 0. And if we try to define object.define property, define a new property on this object, pass through the object, or let's say I want to modify it, I want to put x, and I want to modify it with this value of, let's say value is going to be 100, and we'll put writable as false. So now if we console.log this non-writable objects, we get the result as expected. So we modify this to be 100. But now if we try to do non-writable object.x is equal to 100, we'll get an error. It says we can't assign to a read-only property x of object. So it's pretty much just saying that since this is a non-writable property, we're not able to override it down here. Whereas in normal JavaScript, we would be able to modify it just like this down here as well. So another thing we can't do is write to a get property either. So let's imagine that we had another object. And let's say this will get, let's say, result, and we'll just return 200. So now if we try to write to this get property, so we'll do get object.result, result equals to 300, and just comment this out up above, we're going to get the same error. So we can't set property result which only has a getter. So these are two differences with strict mode and JavaScript objects that we can't do. So let's go on to the next one. Another thing that we can't also do is we can't delete variables, objects, or functions. This means using the delete keyword as well. But one thing we can do is we can still delete object properties. So let's imagine we had a variable, let's say, let's say, I don't know, random number is equal to 500. So we won't be able to delete this number if we go delete random number. So this, so we see we have a delete of an unqualified identifier in strict mode. This is the error that comes up when you try to delete a variable, an object, or a function when strict mode is enabled. So we're not able to do that, but we can still delete object properties. So we do I'll just comment these two out, and we make an object. We'll just give this a property of x, 0, y, 0, and if we deleted the object.x, see, this is fine, it turns green. And now if we console log this out, down below this, you'll see that x is deleted successfully. So this strict mode doesn't let us delete these three up here. So another thing that we can't do is use reserved keywords in JavaScript in variable names or function names. So imagine that we tried to create a variable, say, let's say let static equals to a string static. Let me save that. We get an error saying unexpected strict mode reserved word. So in normal JavaScript, we'd be able to use this keyword, but in strict mode, all these reserved keywords can't be used. So things like static, say interface, we have public, private, we won't be able to use any of those. So another thing we can't do, mentioned in the intro, was that we can't use duplicate parameter names. So let's say we had a function, let's say we had sum, and we'll add up a and b, and this will just return a plus b. So let's call this with a 1 and 2. So this code will run fine because these are different, and we should be able to, let's just add console log above this, and we get 3. But if we change this to a, we get another error. So duplicate parameter name is not allowed. So in JavaScript with strict mode, we're not allowed to use duplicate parameter names. So that's important to keep in mind if you are using strict mode. So the next thing here that we'll be looking at is the eval statement with strict mode. So without strict mode, eval, variables created in an eval statement would be created in the scope that the eval is called in. But with strict mode, it doesn't create the variables in the scope that is called in. So let's take a look to explain this. So we create a function called eval test, and then we'll call the eval test. So now let's get rid of strict mode first, and then let's say eval, and we'll do a var x equals 10. That'll be console.log x, we get 10. That's because without strict mode, the variables in this eval statement would be created in the scope it was called in. So since the eval was called in this function, the var x will be created in this function scope. Sort of imagine it going var x equals 10 here. But so now if we uncomment the strict mode, you'll see here that x is not defined. That's because now this variable wasn't created in this function scope here. Strict mode prevented that. So this is something that's also important to take into account if you're using eval statements in strict mode. And moving on, we also have the with keyword isn't allowed in strict mode. So for example, if we do with, let's first create an object just to use in it. We'll do like a math object or something. Total is 0, and we'll do a sum just equal to a function that adds up an a and a b. So now we want to do with math objects, and let's say we wanted to change the total equals to a sum of 100 and 100. But already in here we can see that we get an error saying strict mode may not include a with statement. So basically with strict mode, this with keyword doesn't work at all. So we're not able to use this anymore. Which is fine because strict mode, the with keyword isn't really recommended to be used anyway. And with strict mode, it disables it completely. So for the last one, and one of the important ones I think, is that in strict mode, this acts a little differently. So by default in JavaScript, if there is no object, then this would point to the window object. But in strict mode, the object, if not specified, will point to undefined, or will have nothing in it. So let's say we had an object of the math object again. I'll just grab that here. So we have a math object, and let's also say we had a function of my function again, and we're going to console log this. So if we call it now, call it. So here we'll see is undefined. In a usual JavaScript, you think this will be a window, but in strict mode, it becomes undefined because there's no object specified. But let's say we want to bind this math object to this function I created here. And we'll do a math function dot bind, and we'll pass through the math object. And we'll also invoke it. So now we can see this is equal to this math object that I binded right here. So this is the only way that in strict mode won't be undefined. Otherwise, by default, it will just be undefined as you saw before. So this is very important in strict mode context because the behavior is a bit different, and the window object, it won't get referred to anymore. So one thing that should be noted is that with the introduction of JavaScript modules, so JavaScript modules, the contents of these files are automatically using strict mode by default. So which means that these files don't have to declare the use strict like we do. It just automatically uses strict mode by default. So that's all for today. So hopefully you know more about strict mode now. If you have any suggestions on any ideas you want to learn about, let me know in the comments below. If this video helped you, hit the like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.